This week on the Lectures in History podcast, the focus is on slavery in the state of Kentucky. When Kentucky became a state in 1792, it faced a choice: keep slavery or abolish it. University of Kentucky professor Melanie Goan explores the state's decision and its complicated relationship with the institution of slavery. She also traces how slavery persisted in Kentucky until the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. More after this.
Hi guys, nice to see you. We are talking about Kentucky's early roots this week as preparation for this course, thinking about the making of modern Kentucky. And last time we said that Kentucky was attracting a lot of notice, a lot of attention in the 18th century. A lot of groups focused and thinking about how they could use this area that will later become Kentucky. So we talked about Native Americans, the first people to use this land, who used it as both a hunting ground and a homeland, we said. We pointed out that European powers, the great empires of Europe, were looking at this area of the Ohio River Valley and sizing it up and thinking about its possibilities, especially the resources that it could draw from this area, and a lot of conflict over this interior of North America. And then we talked about settlement beginning and the great rush into Kentucky, people who were running mad for Kentucky. Starting in 1775, this great flood coming in. And we said last time, in the early 19th century, Kentucky really was the place to be. A place where you could go and start fresh, build a new, better life for yourself. We pointed out the growing population, how quickly Kentucky becomes one of the largest states in the Union. That big population translates into political influence, a lot of voice in Washington. We talked about Henry Clay, very important, very prominent American politician. We talked about how this region was culturally advanced. We talked about the cutting-edge ideas that are coming out of Kentucky. It was new, it was fresh, it was progressive. It seemed like a place where anything was possible. Now, in these early years, if you had asked Americans to define Kentucky regionally, they often in their minds thought of it as the West. And we said Kentucky, the first West, the frontier. This area we're in here, central Kentucky, Lexington especially, known as the Athens of the West. So Americans really categorized us as West to start out. But today, if you asked most Americans, and I think you will agree, to define Kentucky regionally, I think most people would say South, that we're part of the South. How many people agree with that statement? You think of Kentucky, I see people nodding, yeah. You think of it as a southern place. Now maybe you could classify it as Midwest. I guess if you're from Louisville, you may think of yourself as a Midwesterner. But most Americans see Kentucky as Southern. So today we're going to be thinking about this question. If our starting point was Kentucky as the West, how does Kentucky become the South? And we're not the first to ask this question. There are books, in fact, with this exact title. Mary Jean Wall's book, How Kentucky Became Southern. You've been reading Jamie Nicholson's book on the Kentucky Derby. He talks a lot about how Kentucky becomes Southern. And both of these authors really point to horses as playing a critical role in that. The development of the horse industry helps create Kentucky's regional identity. But beyond this, we also have to look at Kentucky's relationship with slavery and its position during the Civil War. It's not just that a new West appears beyond Kentucky, and because of geographical changes, people keep moving west, and now in their minds, that's the West, and Kentucky gets left behind. But we actively become redefined as the South. So we're going to be thinking about, how does that happen? Both slavery and the Civil War are going to profoundly shape Kentucky's story. Even today, we're dealing with the ramifications of these things. We call it a civil war, which if you've ever stopped to think about it, you might think that seems like an oxymoron. What's civil about war? We call it that because the warring parties were countrymen. But on so many levels, this was a brutal war. It was brutal in the violence that people unleashed against each other. It was also brutal for the cause of the Civil War, a war fought to maintain the system of slavery, a brutal system, a system built around what historian Taya Miles calls stolen muscle power. So we could call this an uncivil war. You've learned some things about the Civil War already because you've done the reading for this week. So some things that you learned. One, it was a brothers' war. That's often what we call it. Brothers fighting against brothers, families split apart, churches divided, communities ripped apart for years to come. And probably nowhere else in the country does that description of brothers' war apply more than here in Kentucky. So you learned that about the war. You also learned what side Kentucky took in the conflict. So I'll ask someone, remembering from the reading, what side does Kentucky take in this war? During the Civil War, Kentucky, Union, Confederate, what side will we be on? Anyone willing to?
Union.
Okay, can you wait here just?
Which one? Who had their hand up?
Yeah, right here, I think.
The Union?
The Union, 2 words, yes. Kentucky going to stick with the Union throughout the war. We will never secede. And that's something, if you ask even some Kentuckians, it seems from our what happens after the war that likely we would have seceded, but we don't. We stay in the Union throughout the war. And you can see here some numbers. So collectively, as a state, Kentucky officially with the Union, but individuals in choosing their position in the fight. 40,000 fighting for the South, 100,000 for the North. These are rough numbers, hard to pin down. But I want you to pay attention also to this number at the bottom, the number who decide not to fight at all, because that's really significant too. Now, some of you may have said, wait a minute, I thought Kentucky was neutral in the Civil War. And if you would have said that, you would have been correct as well, although that's only a temporary status. We start as declaring ourselves neutral. Initially, Kentucky really would have liked to stay on the sidelines, but eventually the Union cause is going to win out. But that number I pointed to, the 187,000, suggests how torn Kentuckians were. And it was not something that was typical of Kentuckians to not engage in a fight. Kentucky had a reputation for being a state filled with very patriotic, skilled fighters. During the War of 1812, Kentucky fighters had made their reputation. And so that is really telling, that number of people who want to stay out and Kentucky's initial neutral status. This a really hard decision for Kentuckians. Much harder than for others living further south, I would say. Partly, this was because of geography, where we are located, smack dab between these warring parties. We didn't want to become ground zero in this fight, so that factors into the decision making. You have Kentuckians who, some of them have roots in the north. They had come from places like Pennsylvania, others who had come from the south through Virginia or North Carolina. We talked about the 2 routes into Kentucky, funneling people from different regions. And so that heritage factors into their loyalties. Economic considerations, we can't discount that. Do you have trade relationships? Do you produce something where the primary market is north versus south? How do transportation networks run? What is going to be good for your economic bottom line? That matters. So all of those are factors making it hard for Kentucky to take sides. But when it came down to it, Kentucky's decision primarily driven by slavery and how to best protect it. Kentucky spent the summer of 1861 as a neutral party, even after Lincoln asked them to supply troops. Commander-in-Chief says, we need Kentucky soldiers. Kentucky leaders said, it's all the same to you, we're going to sit this one out. And Lincoln goes along with that, at least at first, because Lincoln recognizes how important Kentucky was. And you've probably seen this famous quote before. To lose Kentucky is to lose it all, Lincoln said. Kentucky was so much to offer, not only its geographic importance, access to the rivers, but men and horses and agricultural commodities it could produce. Lincoln doesn't want to push us over to into the arms of the Confederacy, and so he says, yeah, okay, you can remain neutral. And with Kentucky never seceding, it puts us in a unique position. We're going to remain Unionists, but we're tied very strongly to the South through our system of slavery. Unique among the states. A couple other states in this same category, we call them border states. There you're looking at, beyond Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, those are the border states. States that are in the Union but hold slaves. Now, this seems like a good moment to back up and say more about Kentucky's relationship with slavery. And we said many Americans today assume Kentucky to be South. In your mind, that may be how you've always perceived this place. In that case, it might seem natural and almost inevitable that Kentucky would be a slave-holding state. But when Kentucky became a state, entered the Union in 1792, that was a date. Remember, we said if you know one date at the end of this semester, you should know when Kentucky became a state. 1792, we had a choice. We could have dug slavery out at its roots right there. And slaves already had entered Kentucky. Enslavers had brought their property with them. Slaves, very important in helping to set up the frontier. But we could have chosen to get rid of the institution at that point. Other states were doing it. Massachusetts had done it, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. Vermont came in right before us, entering the Union as the 13th state, or excuse me, the 14th state. We were the 15th. Vermont comes in as a free state. We could have followed their lead. And there were many Kentuckians, a very vocal contingent, especially of ministers, who were urging, they were pleading that Kentucky not be born into sin. That's how they put it. But pro-slavery framers of Kentucky's Constitution would win out, and protections would be added from that very first Constitution onward, increasing in scope over time, protecting the institution of slavery. Now, we have to clear up a myth here early on, a myth that you may have heard that often throughout our history, white Kentuckians as well as historians have endorsed that, yes, Kentucky had slavery, but it was sort of a kinder, gentler slavery. That we were more humane, that the institution was not as brutal here as it was in other places. And I will say, just flat out, that is patently false. Now, one thing we can say about Kentucky slavery is it is different. It's unique in a lot of ways, and that seems to be the word of the day, Kentucky's unique position in the Civil War. We have a unique relationship to slavery. But slavery does look different here than in other places. Now, I would say, how do you measure brutality? How do you say slavery is better in one case than another when someone is owning another human being? In some ways, Kentucky slavery looks a lot more detrimental. If you're worried about people being ripped from family members and separated, Kentucky, in that way, more brutal than other places. But Kentucky different. And one reason for this is the prevalence of slavery in Kentucky, patterns of ownership, the numbers of people enslaved. So we'll take the census of 1860 to illustrate this. And you can look down this list of southern states. It's showing you the free population, the population that's enslaved, and then their percentage as a part of the total population. You look at a place like South Carolina, that number very high, 57% of their population enslaved. You've got Mississippi, you've got Alabama, you've got places in the Deep South, the Cotton South, that have very high slave populations. You look down the list and you get to Kentucky, and it's a smaller number, 19.5%. One historian has said this about Kentucky slavery. It was a middle-class slavery. Luke Harlow says that, meaning there were fewer of the large plantations you might in your mind associate with slavery in the Deep South. If you've ever watched Gone with the Wind or seen representations, maybe the plantation house with the big columns and fields filled with slaves picking cotton. If that's the image in your mind, Kentucky doesn't look like that. In 1860, only 50 farms across the entire state had more than 50 slaves. So in most of these cases, if we're looking at 225,000 people in bondage, in most cases, they're in households where there's just maybe one or two slaves, not a huge contingent. So that made the form and the shape and the everyday interactions of slavery different here in Kentucky. Small scale ownership, but widespread. Middle class slavery. But still, 1 in 5 people in Kentucky in 1860 cannot control their own destiny. Now, most enslaved Kentuckians are concentrated in just a few areas of the South or state. If we look across Kentucky, we see pockets where slavery really is more concentrated. And I'll let you remember in your mind, because you read that in the reading for today, where those pockets are. Hopefully you're thinking here in the central bluegrass area, lots of enslaved people. Western Kentucky, those are the two areas where you see higher holdings. Eastern Kentucky, for instance, most counties, much smaller numbers. So this is regionalized across the state. But some counties, like Woodford County, had over 50% of their population. They look more like South Carolina or Mississippi in the numbers of enslaved people.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Now, in some cases, Kentuckians are making a conscious decision, white Kentuckians choosing not to participate in the slave economy. Maybe because they see it as immoral. There's a continuing thread, those ministers making moral arguments against slavery in the earliest days. Kentucky, you still see later on people who say, yeah, this is morally wrong. But in a lot of cases, people don't own slaves. White prospective owners can't afford to do so. Very expensive. Going price of an enslaved worker, about double what an average Kentucky farmer would earn in a year's time. So in some cases, even people who aspire to enslave cannot do so. So Kentucky, the prevalence, a little different than other places. One thing, though, that's not unique about Kentucky slavery is that it becomes a system of control. And we always have to remember, slavery was not a foregone conclusion in Kentucky or anywhere in the United States. As it was taking shape, especially around the time of the American Revolution, we had a possible chance to go in a different direction. The American Revolution fought for lofty goals like liberty and equality. And there was at least a glimmer of commitment to those ideals in the short run. Coming out of the revolution, it seemed like this revolutionary fervor might make real changes in society. It's likely the reason here in Kentucky, for a short period of time, free black men in the 1790s can vote. That, I think, inspired by this revolutionary moment. New Jersey briefly gave women the right to vote in the 1790s. So these ideals that we hear, and sometimes we think, well, those kind of ring hollow. There was a moment at first where we seemed like we were committed to this and it would bring real change, but it fizzles out pretty quickly. And across the nation, Kentucky included, what we see are laws and structures put in place in the early 19th century to define and protect the institution of slavery, to solidify the position of the enslaved. And you may be familiar with slave codes, slave patrols, policing, to make sure these slave codes were being enforced. Here's an example of one of them here in Lexington. So a system of laws to make sure the relationship between the enslaved and the larger community was protected. So you can see here things like curfews, bans on carrying weapons, slaves needing a pass if they traveled. And this enforced at public expense. So Kentucky is not unusual in this regard, but there are other ways that we are unusual. And I think this is probably the most important of them, is Kentuckians' willingness to question the system. That makes it look a lot different than its Cotton South neighbors. Debate, dialogue, Mississippi, you're not hearing people talk about abolition. If they are, you can imagine the consequences of that. The debate, the possibility for debate, very limited. But in Kentucky, a lot of discussion. What is the future of this institution look like? And Kentuckians willing to, a lot of them, to at least entertain the possibility that over time, in the future, sometime later on, that this institution would naturally die out. And we have some quite radical abolitionists in the state who are sharing viewpoints that even today I think we would say are very radical. Abolitionists like John G. Fee. And you might not know his name, but you likely know what he created. Berea College that exists today, John G. Fee, is one of the founders of that institution. He argued that slavery was an abomination, it was evil in God's eyes, and that it needed to be eradicated immediately. And this is very controversial. He comes from a slave-owning family. Some of his family don't like what he's saying. He's a preacher, stands behind his views. Pretty rare, though, because he believed God had made all men equal, and skin was of absolutely no matter. Berea College, if you know anything about its origins, will be the first interracial institution in the South. After the Civil War, really taking shape, African American students, white students, men and women all learning together in the same classroom. So John G. Fee, an example of a radical abolitionist here in Kentucky. Here's another that likely you've never heard of. James Birney from Danville. We may have some people from Danville here. A planter, slave owner himself, turned abolitionist. By the 1820s, things he was reading, things he was hearing, seeing were really weighing on him. And so he decided he was going to read everything he could about the institution. He was going to do a deep dive, study what the consequences of slavery, the origins, everything he could learn about it. And he read materials including a lot of pamphlets that were written by black authors, so seeing things from their eyes, the arguments they were producing to attack slavery. And this caused him to completely change his life. He freed his slaves. He started an anti-slavery newspaper. He had to move it to Cincinnati because some of his neighbors didn't like it necessarily. He runs for president later as part of the Liberty Party. So we've got some examples of Kentuckians who are very vocal, very outspoken on this topic, making Kentucky a little unusual for the amount of dialogue and how this dialogue continues over time. Now, most Kentuckians, however, are not willing to see the institution immediately abolished. Kentuckians tended to fall into the category of emancipationists rather than abolitionists. And one form of emancipation that gains a lot of popular support in Kentucky is the idea of colonization. Henry Clay plays a role in this, very active in this movement. And this is a national movement. It's not just in Kentucky. Kentucky, though, has a chapter of the American Colonization Society. You can see down there Henry Clay has signed his name to it. The basic idea of colonization to turn back the clock, to send emancipated slaves back to Africa, that this would be a way for the nation to divorce itself from the institution. Part of the idea of this was that white and black could not live peacefully together, that the only way to emancipate slaves was also then to relocate them. And to this end, the US government purchased land in Liberia, on the west coast of Africa, and created a freed slave colony called Liberia. You've probably heard of Liberia. Within Liberia, there was a state called Kentucky. There was it's marked with a blue star up there. That was the area that was known as Kentucky. There was a city called Clay Ashland. There, Clay, a nod to Henry Clay. Liberia, literally meaning land of freedom. Now, there's going to be some problems with this concept, this idea of colonization. And you can probably, in your mind, imagine what some of the problems might be. One, it's very expensive. A lot of cost involved. Not only did you have the value of the slave that was being lost or given up, you also had travel costs, setup costs. Most enslavers, if they're benevolent enough to consider colonization, they're not going to send you with nothing. So maybe some tools and clothing and startup costs. Another problem, for these enslaved being sent to Liberia, this is not their homeland. This is a part of the world they've never seen before, many of them born in the United States. So this idea of sending them back to their home just doesn't even make logical sense. Another problem, disease. Setting up a new society, the fact that there are people living in this area already, the conflict that's going to cause. But the bigger problem is just the limited nature of it. Kentucky enslavers sent, over a 30-year period, about 650 of their bondsmen and women back to Liberia. 650, and we said by the 1860s there are 225,000 enslaved people in Kentucky. That's not going to cut it. Maybe gradually, but how many thousands of years are we talking about here, right? Someone likened it, it's like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. Kentuckians liked the idea of emancipating slaves in theory. White Kentuckians, following the lead of Henry Clay, this idea sounds good in theory. The reality of it, though, a little harder to bear. And I want to play a video here. Let me turn the sound back on. This is from Ashland Estate. So Henry Clay's home here in Lexington. If you haven't visited, you should go and check it out, maybe on a nice Saturday. Ashland has produced this video talking about Henry Clay's views on slavery and the institution at Ashland. So we'll watch this here for a minute.
Ashland was home to a large community of people enslaved by the Clay family. The record of their lives is very fragmentary. In most cases, little more than names and passing references. Many of the places where they lived and worked, including the slave quarters at Ashland, are long gone. At least 122 persons appear in family records as enslaved by the Clay family. Henry Clay himself purchased about 60 of them. Little more is known about them, and so the job of recreating their lives has been very difficult. Most of the people enslaved at Ashland were put to work in agriculture. Henry Clay was one of the nation's leading producers of livestock, all raised by slave labor. Henry Clay enslaved more people for hemp than anything else, and it was very nasty and unhealthy work. Clay made much of his fortune from his farm and the labor of the people he enslaved to work it. The comfort and opulence the Clays enjoyed in their home also came from the labor of enslaved people. Cooking, child care, cleaning, and many other tasks at Ashland were done by enslaved people, often with great skill. These tasks could be intimate and often unpleasant, and often kept enslaved people from caring for their own homes and families. Life for those enslaved at Ashland was often very painful and difficult. They faced brutal physical punishment like whipping and endured many other forms of violence. The best documented family of enslaved people at Ashland is the Dupuis family, enslaved here for decades as coach drivers, valets, cooks, and caregivers. We know something more about them largely because Charlotte Dupuis sued Henry Clay for her freedom and that of her children. The only images of enslaved people we have from Ashland's history are of Charlotte Dupuis' husband, Aaron, and her son, Charles. By the time of his own death in 1852, Clay had freed Charlotte and other members of her family. They were among the few he emancipated. Freedom for others at Ashland and in Kentucky would wait until the 13th Amendment in December 1865.
Okay, so that gives you a little sense of Ashland, how it ran with the use of enslaved workers. Henry Clay very vocally saw slavery as detrimental, but he depended on their labor. That allowed him to go to Washington. That allowed him to be successful in his other pursuits. But he supported the idea of colonization. He stood behind it and promised to colonize his own slaves. But, this is kind of important, not during his lifetime. He did free Lottie Dupuis, the video mentioned her, and her family, but it took her suing for her freedom, and Henry Clay fought that very vigorously, trying to prevent her from being freed. Henry Clay took steps thinking about the future of slavery, the future of people enslaved on his property, and wrote his will, freeing slaves in the future, the children of slaves born after January of 1850. But not immediately. These children who were born after 1850, and this is going to be a little bit of a math problem here, born in 1850, males when they reach the age of 28, females at the age of 25. Can someone tell us what's the earliest year that any of Henry Clay's enslaved property is going to be freed? Yeah? 1875. 1875. Yeah, 1875. No. 1878. Males 28 years after 1850.
Yeah, females
18. Oh, what's the earliest? Sorry. Yeah, I was thinking the latest. Yeah. So well into the future. Henry Clay, he was born in 1777. He's likely not going to be around by the time this happens. So some white Kentuckians here like the idea of emancipation, but by the 1840s, debates start to quiet down. A lot of the discussion, the thoughts about gradual emancipation start to fade. And when Kentucky writes its third constitution in 1850, you can see it states very specifically that enslaved people are property, and property rights are above any other right in the state. As both a racial control system and as an economic foundation for the state, slavery's continuation now seemed essential. Which raises a question: why slavery was so important in Kentucky. Across the Deep South, it was the cotton gin that really gave new life to the institution. Here in Kentucky, we don't grow much cotton. We have shorter growing seasons. In a lot of ways, slavery didn't make financial sense here.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
But economically, slaves serve a new role for Kentuckians by the 1820s, 1830s. After the slave trade, the international slave trade comes to an end. New supplies of slaves are not coming into the country. We got to grow our own. And Kentucky becomes a market for these enslaved people to other regions of the country. So where they're growing all that cotton in Mississippi and they need more slaves, Kentucky becomes a supplier. Slaves become a cash crop in and of themselves. Exporting people becomes Kentucky's lifeblood. Here in Lexington, we're an important spot in the domestic slave trade. Louisville, slave markets that are very important. And I'll point out this website that you can look at some point this week. The Filson Historical Society has put together a really great website thinking about the economic impact of slavery across the city of Louisville. And the wealth that derives, as they call it, from human trafficking, not just the enslavers profiting, but a whole system of the profits flowing down to bankers, to insurance agents, to boat captains, to manufacturers who are building plows and even producing blue jeans and clothes, Kentucky hemp going to support this industry. The domestic slave trade, this is where the idea of being sold down the river comes from. Nearly 77,000 Kentuckians forced from their families and their homes. Here you can see a slave coffle moving them over land, chained together, the abuses of this system. The auction block, selling slaves, becomes the way families, white families, are purchasing pianos, supporting a lifestyle. Unfree people taken from their communities and reminded in the most brutal ways that they were simply property to be bought and sold for the enrichment of others. And the fierce desire to protect this institution drives Kentucky's position in the Civil War. It drives Kentucky leaders' decision making. Kentucky puts its faith in the Union because, if you read the arguments, Kentucky leaders believe that the U.S. Constitution is the best means to protect slavery. They have faith in the U.S. Constitution and that property rights are respected in this country. Kentucky leaders also soothed by Lincoln's promises that emancipation was not an objective of this war, that the Republican Party was only focused on stopping the spread of slavery to new places. Kentuckians hear that and they trust that. Now, certainly not everyone agrees with the position Kentucky ends up taking, remaining in the Union. Many enslavers, particularly in Western Kentucky, we see a lot of active support for the Confederacy. And in fact, a provisional government from Kentucky will be admitted into the Confederacy. It was never really a functioning government, but a contingent of Kentuckians who support the Confederacy throughout. And this sharp disagreement makes Kentucky a really violent place throughout the war. We see formal action early on, 1862. South called it the Kentucky Campaign. They wanted to liberate Kentucky from the Union. The one decisive battle in the state, Perryville, a terrible, bloody encounter that brought the reality of war home to Kentuckians. So not as much formal fighting, but irregular violence going on throughout the war years. Guerrilla warfare plaguing the state, most famously John Hunt Morgan, his raiders, best remembered. Some of this violence happening because of disgruntled former Unionists who are coming home to enact revenge. Sometimes it's just ne'er-do-wells who are using the disruption of the war to prey on their neighbors and do evil things. You can see here this quote by someone living in Allen County down on the Tennessee border in western Kentucky. Life in Kentucky, even if the armies are not fighting here in the state, the disruption happening often on a daily basis. And this violence increasing when it became clear that slavery might not survive the war. By 1862, Lincoln had become convinced that we could not finish this war without finishing off slavery. Costs were too high. Lincoln had been dealing very gently with Kentucky, even when its Unionist loyalties were declared. Lincoln still worried we could go over to the other side, which is why in 1862, Lincoln made a very generous proposal to Kentucky enslavers. He tells them, you write a plan for gradual compensated emancipation, and we will back it. The federal government will allow you to set the terms. You can choose the date. He said, say 1880 was the example he gave. You can dictate the terms of payment, maybe $400 per slave. He suggested colonization. There's cheap land in South America. He said, we can send the slaves there. But he warned if Kentuckians didn't take the deal, slavery will be abolished one way or another, he said, by mere friction and abrasion. This institution is breaking down. Here's your chance to you've stayed loyal, you can end slavery on your terms. Now, of course, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln is writing another plan, another famous document at the very same moment. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to go into effect January 1st, 1863. Most white Kentuckians had little love for Lincoln before this. He was a very controversial figure here in Kentucky. But certainly after the Emancipation Proclamation happens, they're really worried about the future. Kentucky leaders spit at his offer of gradual compensated emancipation. They knew that their property was safe. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply here in Kentucky. But over the following years of the war, 1863, emancipation, by 1864, the Union Army is enlisting black soldiers. Eventually, Kentucky slaves going to be called up and put in uniform. Kentuckians outraged by this. White Kentuckians, an example of this. Colonel Frank Wofford. He refuses to hold his tongue. He says Kentuckians will never stoop to fight along black soldiers. He was a cavalry officer. He gave long-winded speeches, hours and hours, talking about what a fool Lincoln was, that he was a tyrant. And this goes on for a while. Wofford, a Union soldier, officer, finally he's going to be arrested and given a dishonorable discharge. But Kentuckians, white Kentuckians, say he's a hero. They celebrate him. They actually are going to vote him into the U.S. House of Representatives the following year. So in this state, we were Union, but a lot of support for continuing the institution of slavery. In discussion section or on your own time, go to this U.S. Colored Troops project. It's up on Canvas. You can read the bios of black soldiers who fought from this state. Kentucky had one of the highest numbers. Give me just 1 minute here to finish up. I know we're out of time. So today, we don't think of Kentucky as the West anymore. Hopefully this has helped you see a little why Americans have come to associate Kentucky with the South. Certainly Kentuckians, during and after the Civil War, saw themselves in that way. Kentucky going to hold on to slavery longer than almost any other place in the country. The war doesn't end slavery. Only the 13th Amendment will do that. And Kentucky doesn't ratify the 13th Amendment till 1976. We also went on a spree of building monuments after the war, the vast majority dedicated to the Confederacy and Confederate soldiers, maybe in your own communities. So Kentucky, in their minds, white Kentuckians embracing the lost cause after the war and putting themselves, allying with the losers in this war. And so when we're thinking about Kentucky as a southern place, all of this helps explain that shift that goes on. Okay, next week we're going to be talking about signature commodities in Kentucky: horses, bourbon, and tobacco. I'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.